Hello, Glenn.
Hello, Volker.
In the virtual green room, we talked about people influencing you. Who was the most influential astrologer you experienced going up to the Academy of Astropsychology?
Well, for sure, Richard Eidemann. I mean, he was really my teacher for 12 years. I had read there wasn't a lot of good astrology books, in very many astrology books at all, back when I started to study astrology. That was back in the early 70s. There was a lot of stuff by Richard. Richard had really not written anything, Richard Eidemann. Liz Green hadn't written anything at that point. So there was very few books. There was a big book by Sequoian and Acker called The Astrologer's Handbook that was very useful in the sense that it provided kind of a summation of what signs, houses, planets, aspects meant, and she gave an interpretation, or they gave an interpretation of planets in different sign positions, house positions, aspects. It was kind of, very thorough and nuts and bolts kind of interpretations, and it was a really, really good place to start from. Although, like most astrology then, and to a large extent now, it was still, not really what we would call psychological, or that I would call psychological, in the sense that it sort of limited itself to surface behavior and events. So even though it was more personality rich in its descriptions of human behavior than traditional astrology had been in the past, preceding the 20th century and Alan Leo and the birth of so-called psychological astrology, it was still limited to surface traits and behavioral characteristics, personality features, and things like that. Nothing like what I consider to be psychological astrology in the way that I do it at present.
Okay. In your lecture in Istanbul, I think it was Free Will, Fate, and Karma, you mentioned Fritjof Capra, and I believe you also mentioned Ilya Prigogine with his dissipative structures, and David Bohm. Could you talk a little bit about that? How is that important for you?
Well, I wanted to, and this kind of goes back to my dissertation days when I was at Saybrook between early 80s to early 90s. I was really interested in trying to understand how the universe works such that astrology could be a part of it. In other words, if astrology was part of the cosmos, what is the nature of the cosmos? And is consciousness the primary reality? That was really my main question. Do we live in a conscious universe that it has intention and purpose? And if so, how does that purpose and intentionality in the universe communicate itself through astrology? And so I was interested in really kind of going back to the origins of the universe and the Big Bang. And so I was studying a lot of, not a lot, but astrophysics, especially in the tradition of David Bohm, so-called new physics, of which Ilya Prigogine was a part, Fritjof Capra, a lot of other people that were integrating physics into spiritual frameworks and consciousness studies in general. So Capra was really very useful in the sense that he wrote a comprehensive book on general systems theory called The Turning Point. But he was really, honestly, just one of dozens of people that I was reading in general systems theory. I picked him out because I think his book was one of the more useful ones. But, in my dissertation, I had to have a lot of references and really read a variety of authors in the fields of new physics, evolutionary biology, general systems theory, looking at the physical sciences to try to find evidence of how consciousness works really from the ground floor all the way up the chain of being. And so that's how those authors came to my attention.
Is your dissertation available in book form?
No, actually, I think it might be at some point, but I've been so busy writing in astrology, I never really took the time to put that dissertation into book form, but I've always meant to. Well, so at some point, I'd like to kind of update it and bring it into...
On this channel, especially for you on this channel, I made a tutorial in English to publish your dissertation, for example. It takes you about 1 hour and it's available on the book market. So just look at the tutorial.
I will.
Okay.
Thank you for that too.
When we talked about
inspiration.
when we talked about people like Vajratanas and others in astrology, we saw their interest in psychology more theoretical than practical. In other words, without psychological training or ongoing work with clients as far as you know. For that matter, in your opinion, neither did Richard Eidemann, though Richard was certainly more psychological orientated, mostly Jungian, than philosophical. Astrologers appreciate Jung because his theory of archetypes, spirituality, and general worldview is compatible with astrology. And of course, he was open to astrology and gave it some credence. So he's a bit of a patron saint for psychological astrologers. However, while Jung's analytical psychology provides a useful meta model, a kind of overarching umbrella theory, in your opinion, there's much more to psychology than Jung. For the most part, this is largely ignored by psychological-oriented astrologers who are so enamored with Jung they can't see beyond him. More therapeutically useful models, such as psychodynamic theory, cognitive behavioral, general systems theory, object relations, and narrative theory, are far more relevant to how people actually live their lives day to day in the trenches than Jungian theory. That seems to be something special. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, you just, I know that I wrote that to you, and there's a lot in there. To sort of really unpack all that, that's, would take a lot of time. But let me see if I can sort of cut to the chase. What I'm essentially saying is that while I think Jung is inordinately important in that I think he provides a sort of umbrella theory in which astrology can be situated, and is probably the most important psychological theorist as far as compatibility between psychology and astrology is concerned. He's not the end of the journey. Well, maybe he's the beginning and the end, but in between, there's a lot of other psychological concepts, theories, models that are enormously useful and relevant and easily integrated with astrology that enrich and deepen and clarify what astrology can be. See, and Jung is limited in what he did so far as I think the relevance again of these other psychological models, what they can bring to the field of astrology. For example, psychodynamic theory. Jung was, it was really just in the beginning of our understanding of psychodynamics. Jung, to some extent, was building on Freud's work, and that started way back in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, and then Jung further developed it with his own particular spin. But our understanding of psychodynamics has really evolved considerably since then. When you apply those concepts to our understanding of what the chart symbolizes as psychic structure, and in a sense as psychodynamics, so that every planet in a sense represents a center or its own kind of component of the psyche that has intentionality, that has feeling, that has a particular goal state that it's striving for. It's a basic motivational principle. It's associated with certain kinds of cognitive structures when in aspect to other planets. There's ways in which planets, when they're in aspect with one another, operate as defenses. It can be thrown into shadow, parts of the chart that get repressed, other parts that get exaggerated. There's like 40 or 50 different psychological defenses that we understand now, all of which can be classified under the heading of planets when they're operating in a way that is in conflict with other parts of the self, as symbolized by hard aspects in particular. And so how those psychological defenses and the intrapsychic world operates is way more sophisticated in our understanding now of the psyche than was possible in Jung's time. And yet all that information is largely ignored in the field of psychological astrology because people are sort of so, again, enamored with Jung and his psychology that there's this rich mine of material that we can pull from object relations theory, psychodynamic theory, cognitive behavioral theory, general systems theory, narrative approaches to theory that is just it's ignored. I mean, it's not ignored by me. I incorporate all those ideas into my approach to as what I call astropsychology.
Okay. The accredited master program Archetypal Cosmology and Conscious Evolution in the Graduate Institute of Connecticut was the precursor for the Academy for Astropsychology. It was more heavy in courses on conscious evolution and consciousness, whereas the Academy of Astropsychology program emphasizes the integration of astrology with a variety of psychological concepts and models. AAP trains astrologers in how to actually work with clients in a therapeutically useful manner. That was not the focus in the TGI. What was TGI?
The Graduate Institute. That was where
right.
I had developed my 2-year master's degree program in archetypal cosmology and conscious evolution.
Would you agree that what you did in Connecticut is sort of the practical archetypal cosmology, whereas what the people in the CIIS in San Francisco are doing is more the theoretical archetypal cosmology?
Well, you could say that. I mean, I'm very interested in the theory as well, but I think I've taken the theory not just of archetypal cosmology. Again, the term archetypal cosmology is a sort of overarching theoretical model in which can be housed these other approaches, that are called psychological. It's more like a philosophical framework, archetypal cosmology. So as a psychotherapist, I'm interested in how to utilize astrology as a diagnostic and prognostic tool in the context of ongoing client work, ongoing therapy work with clients, but not just in ongoing work, also in terms of single session work in astrological consultations. So to utilize astrology in a practical, therapeutic manner, to really understand what is the nature of the problem that the client is presenting. How does it relate to both an outer and an inner connection, so that a client comes in with so-called a presenting problem, and the astrologer has to locate that problem in the chart. It's sort of like pin the problem on the chart, find the most relevant configuration that matches the particular description of the client's issue or struggle or conflict. And there's always an outer. Usually when a client comes in, they talk about some sort of experience they're having in the outer world. It's a problem with their spouse or with their kids or with their bosses or coworkers, or it can be any number of relationship dynamics that people have with the outside world. They may be procrastinating and hung up creatively, have a creative block, you name it. But it's generally related to something that they're striving to achieve in the outer world, and they're feeling frustrated. So there's very little description in the client's presenting problem of the inner underlying psychological variables that are relevant to that problem. And that's where the chart really comes in handy, because, as I was saying last week, it symbolizes both the client's experience of the outer world, the pattern of events that sort of follows them from childhood right through adulthood, so-called fate. But every variable in the chart that corresponds to fate also corresponds to an inner psychological factor. So understanding the nature of the presenting problem as they describe it in terms of the relevant underlying psychological variables, that's where I think psychological astrology really can be of enormous value. And it goes beyond, I think, the usual way in which psychological astrology has been conceptualized. And this is what I'm meaning about, the theory of Jung as applied to astrology is really interesting and valuable to a point, but really utilizing that theory in a therapeutic way, see, and so that what you say to a client and how you understand their internal world in relation to their presenting problem requires an understanding of certain concepts that Jung, they just don't exist in Jung,
Okay.
or Freud for that matter.
So coming back to the course in the master program, cosmology, archetypal cosmology and conscious evolution, what is conscious evolution and consciousness in your worldview?
Boy, those are big questions, but again, trying to cut to the chase. I think consciousness is what we might consider the intelligence of the universe. It's an abstract, obviously intangible, invisible feature. But if you accept the idea that universal consciousness, or the nature of the universe is consciousness, that's the primary irreducible reality, and that everything that precipitates out of that in terms of the material world, the visible world, is a manifestation of patterns of consciousness in the mind of some kind of superordinate being. And admittedly, I mean, I always feel a little uncomfortable when I'm talking about this kind of thing, because it's largely a matter of faith and inference and to some extent speculation. There's no way of proving these things, I suppose, although you can make a pretty strong argument that there is some sort of spontaneous ordering principle, some kind of intent that seems to be at the heart of the universe, such that it didn't evolve randomly. Increasingly we're seeing evidence of this in astrophysics, like the anthropic cosmological principle and that sort of thing. So, what is universal consciousness? It's this all-pervasive, transcendent mind that is also immanent in all things and processes on a biological and physical level. And the soul, I think, is a particularization. It's like we're the microcosm reflecting the macrocosm, so that every human being and psyche constitutes a fragment of that larger consciousness in which we're embedded, like being a cell in the body of the divine being.
Okay, so in your book, in this one,
yes,
An Introduction to Astropsychology, a synthesis of modern astrology and depth psychology by Glenn Perry. In the first chapter, you talk about the anima mundi, which is, I believe, a rather old term. Is anima mundi the same as the universal consciousness you were just talking about?
I think a lot of these things are just, kind of linguistic differences, terminological differences, but they don't really mean substantially different things. Anima mundi is the world soul. It kind of goes back to Platonic philosophy, the idea of nous, universal intelligence. Or psyche with a capital P, the larger psyche, of which every individual psyche is a microcosmic reflection, comprised of the same archetypal principles and components as exist in the universe at large. By the way, you asked a question about what is conscious evolution previously, and I didn't get a chance to say that, or answer that. So because I think it's an important idea, because I think astrology is a wonderful tool for facilitating conscious evolution, which is the idea that if we believe that the overriding thrust of the universe is evolution, growth and further development of forms and beings, then to consciously, intentionally collaborate with the universal intent is, in a sense, to evolve consciously. So to see everything that happens as in some way synchronistic with, reflective with, a catalyst for a developmental process. In other words, everything that happens to us is in some way purposeful and meaningful. And astrology becomes a language for discerning the meaning and the purpose of the particular patterns of events that we draw to us and experience, and to use them in a conscious, intentional way to further our own development. In so doing, that's to collaborate. consciously, willingly, with the larger intention of the cosmos.
Okay. So this is the background about what we are now talking.
Yes.
Let's dive into theory and practice of astropsychology in the Academy of Astropsychology in Connecticut. First question, where is the Academy located and why?
Well, it's located everywhere and nowhere, sort of like consciousness. It's non-local. It's a distance learning school in the sense that, you know, it's a school without walls. It's online. So right here in this room is where the school is, in one sense, if you want to localize it, in Haddam Neck, Connecticut. But we have students all over the world. So just like we're tuning into one another via the internet, you know, the last 10, 15 years, this kind of thing that we're doing right now has suddenly become possible for the first time in human history. And it allows for an educative process, the kind of online school that I do, that wasn't possible in the past.
Your activity in Beijing in China, is that done from your place where you're sitting now?
Right here. Exactly. So I just talk to them in the same way that I'm talking to you, except I'm talking to 100 students online all over the country of China.
And do the students in China all speak English?
No, it's translated.
Oh, okay.
Some do speak English, but a lot of them don't. So, you know, I have to speak in these little bite-sized chunks, and then there's somebody in Beijing that translates what I'm saying into Chinese.
I can't do that, even listen. I hate it if a lecture is interrupted by translation, but that's my problem.
It's very, very difficult. I have to admit, it's really hard.
On your homepage, one can read that you have retreats. Did a retreat already happen after the second?
No. You know, that's a kind of a goal that I've always had, but you know, it's been one thing or another that's gotten in the way of that. But at some point, I'd love to have people come here to Connecticut because the site is just beautiful. I mean, I've got 8 acres of property. It's right on the Connecticut River. I've got kayaks and canoes and a little jet boat and you know, hiking trails, and it's just a gorgeous place. And sit out on the back deck and look at the river and talk astrology. It's kind of a fantasy that I've always had, but I haven't gotten around to actually manifesting it yet.
I was wondering, I realized you don't read German, so you are not familiar with the German literature in astrology, right?
Very little. Yeah. There's that fellow that did a lot of work on the tropical sidereal zodiac that I have read, but he wrote in English.
That's Dieter Koch, right?
Yes, Dieter Koch. Yeah. Thank you.
Dieter Koch, working with Astrodienst, and Dieter Koch has written the critique of the astrological reason, like Kant.
Oh, well, I have to read that. Is that in English?
That's in German. We have to find somebody to translate it. I was wondering.
He's brilliant. I really enjoyed him.
In Switzerland, Austria, and Germany, there are quite a number of people writing books like yourself. So you don't know that because you can't read German, and they don't know that you exist because they haven't found out that your book exists. And I was wondering, would you be interested to doing a webinar like with this technology with Christoph Schubert-Weller, for example? That is one of our main philosophers in astrology in Germany.
You mean that he would translate me, or
no, that you two would do the same thing we two do, talking English, but you talking to an expert. I'm no expert. He is an expert. And he could discuss with you things I can't even imagine. Would you be interested in doing that?
Oh, yeah, that sounds like that'd be a lot of fun.
I'm telling it. Okay, I'll tell him. Okay, now before we dive into the details, 2 questions about the framework of astropsychology. You are not using Placidus houses. Instead, you apply equale manier, equal houses with.
Yeah, I don't know. I want to just stop you here because I don't know where you got that idea. There's some kind of misunderstanding.
There's
no,
2 houses
for Placidus houses.
You use the Placidus houses.
Yeah.
But in your book, you're talking about the 2 hours ascending, and that
it's a rough approximation of what occurs in.
So you are using the Placidus house.
I use Placidus, yeah. Yeah.
And how
In
do you...
general, though, the houses are like the zodiac, divided up into 12 divisions, just like the
So that's a
24-hour day is
misunderstanding coming
divided
from
into
the
12
book.
parts.
Okay. But then still the question, how do you justify that approach? You could use whole sign houses, you could use 30-degree houses, you could use regiomontans, you could use
That's right.
compasses.
Yeah.
Do you have, I use Placidus myself. I don't have an argument. Do you have an argument?
No, I don't.
So you learned it by Richard as I learned it from my teacher.
Largely, to be perfectly honest, I learned Placidus. I got used to Placidus.
Okay.
I have heard some lectures on the different house systems.
Yeah, okay.
And one lecturer in particular had mentioned that the Placidus was the most mathematically sophisticated and unique in the way that it conceptualizes the division of houses. And I can't give you all the reasoning and the logic and the mathematics behind it. It's kind of beyond me. It's beyond my interest, especially. So, but I 40 years of working with clients. Of course, I think probably any astrologer would say the same thing, no matter what their house system is.
Yeah, but you have a practical problem. Considering the fact that you are an online academy, what happens if somebody from close to the North Pole wants to attend your classes? Placidus doesn't work there.
I don't know how to answer that question.
Okay. You didn't have a client from there up till now.
Yeah, there's not too many people that are living up in the North Pole studying astrology.
But technology would allow.
Kind of a non-problem.
Yeah, okay, and not having met the problem yet. And then a second framework problem, which intrigues me quite a lot. In your book, you are counting for the legend, for the triplicities and the crosses. You are giving sun and moon 2 points and the planets 1 point. In my education, my teacher Nikolaus Klein, saying that this is what he developed because of his practice, he gives the sun and the ascendant 10 points each, the moon 8, the midheaven 7, the inner planets get 5 points, and the outer planets 4. A sum of 72 points. My teacher, Nikolaus Klein, said that's what I came up with because it works. Same thing with you, it works, and that's why you do it?
Yeah, these are kind of heuristic models that sort of approximate via weighting, a kind of quantitative weighting of the significance of the distribution of planets in various signs, elements, modalities, polarities, perspective, in those categories. And so, I don't want to say 6 with one, half a dozen with the other, but that's pretty much what it comes down to. His model, his way of counting, your teacher's way of counting, I think is more nuanced, and maybe is kind of, I think there's a clear logic to it that is similar to the logic of 2 points to the sun and moon, 1 point to every other planet. But I think that model of your teacher is really more, it makes more subtle distinctions, let's say, between an outer planet and an inner planet, because in terms of what you notice in a person's personality, I mean, if I have Venus in Leo, and I can see and I can feel that Venus in Leo in my personality. But if somebody says, well, how does Neptune in Libra show up in your personality? You can't see it. I mean, it's not noticeable. I can't feel it. An outer planet doesn't really have the same weight in terms of how the personality is felt and expressed than does an inner planet. So I think, giving the inner planets a higher number than the outer planets makes sense, actually, even though the model that I use doesn't do that.
And now we go into the book and into your practice of the Academy of Astropsychology. First question, the zodiac and the individual.
What about it?
Tell us what your philosophy is, zodiac and the individual. I'm talking about this stuff here, the basics. Do you see that?
Yeah, basic needs and motives. Yeah, that's a more precise question. Well, the zodiac is really the heart, I think, of astrology. It's like the core bottom level, the substratum from which everything else derives. And I think to really understand a zodiacal sign, you really have to appreciate its multiple manifestations. And I don't mean multiple manifestations in terms of outer events or even behavioral traits, but to think about a sign in terms of, for example, a basic psychological drive, a motivational principle, a basic need. See, that's, I think, the first and most fundamental way of thinking about any sign of the zodiac. It constitutes a primary motivational principle or basic need. Okay? And you can infer that need from the behavioral traits that are characteristic of that sign. So in other words, the need of a sign can be inferred from behavior that is characteristic of that sign. Okay? So people behave in particular ways, not randomly, for no reason. They behave in those ways because they're motivated by a particular need that is operating underneath, often unconsciously. Okay? And every psychological need has a target state. In other words, a state of fulfillment that the behavior is oriented toward attaining. So if the behavior is successful and the person fulfills the drive, the need of that sign, they experience a certain state of fulfillment. So we can say that a zodiacal sign constitutes a basic need and also a target state. Now it's also, as a need or as a motivation, it also symbolizes a range of feelings. Those feelings, in a sense, are the voices of the archetypes or of the sign needs. They rise into consciousness. We become aware of a particular kind of a feeling that is filtering up and through our consciousness. And it's those feelings that motivate or drive the behavior. So you can actually break down a sign of the zodiac along with the planets that are the active agents of those signs, the rulers of those signs, into a whole range of feelings. See, it's like a taxonomy of our affective possibilities of expression and experience. So, need, feeling. The sign also corresponds to a set of behavioral traits. Okay? So you can think about it in terms of actual behavioral characteristics, okay? And you can classify them, in terms of 7 or 8 main themes in each sign with their own behavioral trait keywords. Then from there, you can branch out into the outer world, that a sign also corresponds to parts of the body, but also certain kinds of characters that we encounter in the outside world. And again, when I think about a sign, I'm not separating the sign fully from its planetary representative. I think of signs and their planetary rulers as sign planet systems, because the planet is always operating in the service of the need that the sign symbolizes. So, in terms of the outer world, you can break the outer world down into people, characters, places, things, and events. Those 4 categories are all nouns: people, places, things, and events. And within each of those categories, there's a whole range of phenomena that can be classified under the heading of a sign planet system. So it's a sign of the zodiac, and again, the planets that correspond to it, is an enormously rich taxonomic system for classifying and understanding the way that primary archetype populates out, both internally as well as externally.
Now I come back to this chart. I should have shown you this one. The ages.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, that's the thing I just left out.
Yes, please.
That the signs of the zodiac also correspond to developmental stages, that the zodiac is its own natural developmental model. And, there's been other attempts to do this. The Hubers made some kind of rough early attempts in terms of the houses in particular, dividing the houses up into, I think, 7 distinct periods. But I don't think they got it right, because not every sign is longer in real time in terms of the duration of time that it corresponds to than the sign that comes before. So you have a natural kind of expansion of time that each
Yes.
sign of the zodiac corresponds to.
You have Aries 0 to 2 years, and Taurus 2 to 5 years, and Gemini 5 to 9 years,
That's right.
and Cancer 9 to 14, Leo 14 to 20, and
Yeah, it's 20 to 27 and 27
Virgo
to
is 20
35.
to 27.
Yeah,
And the last one is Pisces 77 to 90 years of development, and that's indeed a difference to the Huber School, the
yes.
Psychological Institute in Switzerland, where they have a different approach on these
Well,
developments.
see, here's the, this kind of goes back to one of my earlier points that a lot of people that call themselves psychological astrologers, their understanding of psychology is skin deep. It's paper thin.
Oh, okay.
And I put the Hubers in that category, and I hate to sound critical of people that are, exponents of the
Well,
Huber method,
you
but
far away enough in Connecticut to get the shitstorm from the Hoovers.
right. I mean, but you look at that developmental model, and almost every developmental model, especially with regard to the zodiac signs that exists in astrology, other than the one that I've developed, and there's no groundedness in developmental theory. I mean, we've got 100 years, at least, of understanding developmental psychology. It's its own specialized department of psychology. And so, the giants in that field like Piaget and Erickson and Kohlberg and others that have spent their entire lives understanding how human development in various lines, cognitive development, psychosexual development, ego development, with Erik Erikson, moral development with Kohlberg, all these individuals that were pioneers in the field of developmental psychology have come up with different models that correspond to certain ages and certain stages and so forth. So it's a very, very rich subdiscipline in the field of psychology for drawing knowledge and information that can be utilized in understanding how the zodiac could conceivably be its own developmental model. And I would argue that the evidence for that is self-evident. I mean, it's overwhelming. But if you don't ground your developmental method in terms of the zodiac in existing knowledge in the field of psychology, well, you're just making stuff up out of thin air. You're not a specialist in the field. Huber was not a specialist in developmental psychology. He just invented this model of 7-year periods
I
with
believe
absolutely no reference whatsoever to developmental psychology. I just find it astonishing that anybody can do that, but people do.
I think that's easily explained. The Hoovers were learning with Roberta Assagioli, and Assagioli was psychosynthesis.
Right. He's not a developmental psychologist.
And not a developmental psychologist.
Yeah.
Okay. If you take,
so in other words, that zodiacal model that you just laid out, Aries 0 to 2, Taurus 2 to 5, Gemini 5 to 9, every sign of the zodiac corresponding to a period that is 1 year longer in duration than the sign before, and 1 year longer than the number of that sign. In other words, if Leo is the 5th sign, it corresponds to a 6-year period. If Virgo is a 6th sign, it's a 7-year period, and so forth. I mean, the arguments and the research that goes into that model is grounded in actual studies in developmental psychology that I draw from. So, and it's the only model in that regard that draws from actual research that's been done in the field of developmental psychology.
So the mathematical calculation you just did with the signs and the number of years is grounded in this psychological research. I was wondering, besides having an interesting model, do you use this model in the practice of advising clients?
Oh yes, yeah. I mean, this is a whole area that is, one of the most exciting things that I'm doing right now. Most exciting for me in any event. And I've done some work and lectures and some writing on it. Very, very little at this point, but eventually I've got to pull all my cases together into a book on this. And it's the idea that, the same developmental model that corresponds to the zodiac also can be transferred to the house system. So you've got 12 houses. The houses correspond to the same periods of time that the signs do. So, for example, if you look at the third house and it corresponds to a period from 5 to 9, if there's planets in that house, then that planet occupies a period, it symbolizes a period of, say, 1 to 2 years. The closer you get to the specific age, the more acute the actual experiences are going to be that correspond to that planet in that particular developmental stage. So let's say, for example, you've got Moon in Pisces opposing, in the third house, talking about an actual case. Moon Pisces that corresponds exactly to 7 years old, and it's opposing Pluto in the ninth house, which corresponds to age 52. See, so you could then hypothesize that at age 7, that individual is going to have an experience that conforms in meaning to that what Moon Pisces opposing Pluto symbolizes astrologically. It's happening at that age 7, within that developmental stage we call Gemini, 5 to 9. But it's going to have there's going to be some sort of pivotal experience of a very acute nature that encapsulates in microcosm the meaning of Moon Pisces opposing Pluto. For example, in the case that I'm mentioning, the little girl is 7 years old. Her mother was overwhelmed by the responsibilities of being a parent, and she abandoned her children. And she had an affair with another man, and she moved out of state. She just completely abandoned her kids. And it was a traumatic experience of loss. It was really tragic for the children that were left behind, particularly this client that had this configuration in her chart that I was working with. So the astrological symbolism that corresponds to that pivotal event in her life couldn't be more accurate to what actually happened to the client. So, in terms of a diagnostic device and even prognostic, because later at 52, which is when she came into therapy, she was at her Pluto point, again activating that same aspect between Moon Pisces in the third to Pluto Virgo in the ninth. And so, again, you could hypothesize that something's going to happen at age 52 that reactivates that trauma that occurred originally at age 7. It provides an opportunity for working through, integrating and healing that particular psychological complex and the trauma that it began with back when she was age 7. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. That's why she came into therapy when she was 52 years old.
This reminds me of a workshop which Richard Tarnas and Stan Groff did in Lucerne 2000 on the World Astrological Conference. They have a special aspect with prenatal experience. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, yes.
Do you use the same method, or do you think that's a little bit too not grounded?
I don't know. I don't really have too much to say about it because I'm not really, I took a workshop or two, I think, and I've, heard some lectures that they've given on this, and it's a rough approximation of planets to perinatal periods prior to birth.
Yeah, I think it starts with Saturn up to Pluto.
Sort of interesting, but and if somebody is having a significant transit, if the child to be is having a transit that is occurring prior to birth or during birth, then theoretically that transit is going to have some bearing on the nature of the birth experience or the intrauterine experience. It sort of makes sense to me.
And question number 2, the zodiac and the human history. You have a special approach to use the zodiac in a second way, not for the individual.
Yes.
Explain.
Well, if the zodiac is a developmental model in terms of what we call ontogeny, ontological development, the development of the individual from birth to death. It's also it might make sense to say it's also a model of the evolution of human consciousness, not just the evolution of consciousness within the framework of a single life and a single person, but the evolution of consciousness as within the human species. And so you could argue that as human beings, we have evolved from, the hunter-gatherer stage that Aries would correspond to going back to 30,000 BC or so. And for a long time, that stage prevailed. And then there was the beginning of agriculture in about 12,000, 10,000 BC, and settled communities where people were starting to farm and trade goods and things like that. And clearly that corresponds to Taurus. And that stage lasted for about 10,000 years, and well, maybe 7,000 years or so. And then there was the invention of writing. For the first time, we had hieroglyphics and early forms of Phoenician writing, and putting into clay tablets, the records of transactions and counting, and eventually development of language and words. And that was the Gemini period, clearly. I mean, just kind of self-evident in a way. That's how things evolved. And in the beginning of nation states with Cancer, and then the medieval period with all the stuff involving knights and castles and damsels in distress, and romantic love began during that period with the troubadours and scholasticism. And you can sort of trace it right through. The scientific revolution began with Virgo, and right on up to the current times, which I would consider we're in a Libran period, post-Enlightenment. The Enlightenment ending at the beginning of the 20th century, and the postmodern age approximately beginning then. So it's a really kind of self-evident, obvious way in which the zodiac symbolizes these periods of human history, each one, interestingly enough, shorter than the one before, precisely the opposite of how it seems to occur in the evolution of consciousness across the lifespan, where each sign of the zodiac represents a period of time slightly longer than the one before. And these periods tracing the evolution of consciousness from the dawn of humanity right on through, each stage is slightly shorter, or maybe even significantly shorter than the one that came before. Don't ask me to explain why that's so. It just seems to be what the evidence indicates.
And there's another point. You are rather strict in denying the ages of humankind, of humanity, according to the movement of the precision.
Right.
Yeah. That's quite unusual.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of confusion around that topic, but the so-called astrological ages, which are based on the precession through the constellations, is predicated on the assumption that the sidereal zodiac, the constellationally based zodiac, actually has validity. And I think that it's wrong. That if you really trace back the origins of the zodiac and how it got mixed up and confused with the constellations, you can begin to understand how it was a misperception. The ancients didn't really understand how the astronomy worked.
So we will not get an age of Aquarius.
No, I just think it's
okay.
It's like saying that that consciousness evolves backwards.
Okay.
And if that were true, it would be the only field of study in the entire field of human knowledge that suggests that somehow evolution proceeds backwards, because you don't go backwards in the zodiac.
Question number 3: the personality theory in the Academy of Astropsychology. What personality theory did you establish in your curriculum?
Well, the personality theory of astropsychology. I mean, if you're asking me the particulars of that, that's a really big conversation. But if you go back and you study personality theory, and this is one of the required courses when you're in graduate school, there's counseling skills and psychopathology and developmental psychology and personality theory and so forth. There's all these basic fundamental primary courses that you have to take. And I was really fascinated with personality theory. I suspect because there's a big theoretician in me. I've got Moon and Sag and Jupiter.
Okay, let me more precise. I have the feeling that Erickson could be close to your theory. Is that correct?
Probably not.
Oh,
No.
okay. Okay. So what would be the
I don't
theory?
really think Erickson was a personality theorist.
No, but when he talks about the developmental resources,
Yeah, he had a developmental model,
yes.
you know, of development. Um, but you know, that's not a personality theory. It's a different thing.
But what's your closest theory then? The main theory, and lots of other theories come together in your academy.
Right, right. I mean, I think astropsychology, if you could call it a personality theory, and I would like to, you know, I would like to really advance it as its own coherent, fully developed personality theory. It's a hybrid. It's a synthesis, and it's not just a conglomeration of other personality theories. Although you know it utilizes and it borrows various concepts and ideas from a whole variety of different models,
Is there
but
a
it adds
main?
something.
Is
It
there
adds something. Pardon?
Is there a main influence?
No, no,
Oh,
I wouldn't want to say. I mean, as I was saying before, I think I would start always with Jung.
okay.
You know, I think Jung is the most compatible personality theory with astrology, but it's like a shell. It's like a shell with a lot of, you know, very broad, basic conceptual frames within that larger shell. But within those broad conceptual frameworks, there is a lot of material to be filled in. And to fill that in, you need to sort of draw from other models like cognitive behavioral theory or psychodynamic theory, object relations theory, which is sort of a branch of psychodynamics. Even narrative therapy, I think, is, although it's not really a personality theory, it's a really important idea that can be incorporated into the idea that the chart as a whole symbolizes a narrative, a story that's internal, and also it manifests externally as our lived experience, our fate. So,
Okay. Question number 4. Planets as psychological processes.
yes.
What's that?
Well, the idea of a process is a series of operations, series of actions that are conducive toward an end. In other words, if you look at a planet, one of the main ways that you can understand it is that it's a form of action. And within that class of actions, there's different related interdependent actions. Like if we talk about Saturn, I'll give you an example of this. I actually have a little, I think, like let's look at Saturn. Can you see this? Oh, you probably can't see this on your screen.
No.
So let me go back to, I can actually share my screen so that everybody can see this.
Yes,
You see that now?
I see blue.
Well, yeah, that's because I need to move this over here. Now
Okay.
you can see it.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Yeah, see, so, you know, if we think of a planet, in this case Saturn, as it's really a psychological faculty, but a faculty is simply a name for a number of functions that that planet symbolizes, just like an organ like the heart or the kidney has a number of functions, biologically speaking. So also a planet symbolizes a psychological organ, and that organ has a number of functions. And so those functions are actions, things that that planet actually does. And those actions can be classified. See, they belong to a set of actions that are all members of the same set, such as the action to order, or to control, or to succeed, or to master. Now, these are just 4 verbs that constitute Saturnian actions. You could come up with many others: to discipline, to achieve, to organize, and so forth. But each one of those actions is in the service of a Capricorn need. See, and again, we were talking earlier about how you can look at the behavioral traits of a sign and infer from that behavior what's the underlying psychological basis, the need that is driving the behavior. And so the planet that rules that sign, in this case Saturn, ruling Capricorn, symbolizes a set of actions, processes, see, that are in the service of satisfying or fulfilling the underlying needs that Capricorn symbolizes. And those processes of Saturn are oriented toward fulfilling the needs and achieving what we call a target state, a state of fulfillment. See? So a process is a series of actions conducive toward an end, a target, a goal, which is fulfillment of the underlying drive. So when you look at any planet in the astrological chart, and you consider the sign that that planet is in, and the house, and the aspects it makes, it gives you some information as to the functionality of that planet. That is, how capable is that planet, in fact, of fulfilling its needs, the needs of the sign that it's trying to rule, that it rules, and the needs of the sign that it's trying to satisfy. So you can assess the functionality of a planet by looking at how it's situated in the chart as a whole, especially the aspects that it makes to other planets, because it might be in conflict with other planets, and as a consequence, there's going to be certain kinds of defenses that are operating, certain kinds of internal dialogues, self-talk, ultimately what we call a cognitive structure, literally a belief that is related to the individual's convictions about the likelihood of being able to fulfill the needs of the signs that it rules, the need of the sign that it rules, in relation to other planets and the signs that they rule. And so ultimately, you're trying to get a sense of what is the client's story? How are they organizing their thinking in relation to lived experience? See, and these larger configurations in the chart, which we call planetary aspects, planets and signs and houses and aspects, symbolize these larger cognitive structures, these internal narratives that ultimately cause people to behave in ways that often compromise their ability to satisfy their basic needs. See, and if you can understand how the chart symbolizes these underlying narratives and help the client become conscious of what those narratives are and begin to, if necessary, revise or alter the internal script, their underlying beliefs, in the direction of more functional, self-affirming, and healthy ways of behaving, then they're going to be in a, that's what we call integration, transformation, healing, and so forth. The outer world begins to reflect back the nature of the integration and growth that's occurred.
Okay, question number 5. We talked a little bit about that already. The needs of the zodiacal signs in the chart. Do you think we have already enough about that, or do you want to add something for the needs of the signs in the chart?
Well, I'll give you another example here, if I can find it. Here is an example, I think, come on. No, this is something different. Let me get out of this slide here, if I can get back to you. I know what I have to do.
Yes.
There we go. Yeah, I can go through the different signs and that sort of thing, or just give you a couple of other examples. But the idea is that every sign represents a set of needs that are inferred from behavioral characteristics of that sign. And it implies that all behavior, anytime you're observing somebody's behavior, you can interpret that behavior in the context of the need that behavior is in the service of. In other words, the behavior is always in the service of trying to fulfill some basic underlying need. So all behavior is purposeful in that regard. And if you can trace the behavior back to the underlying planets, and again, it's never just one planet because everything in the chart is ultimately interacting with everything else. So there's clusters and combinations of planetary factors and different needs that are competing with one another, and then you get what's called emergent properties within the system, sort of behavioral traits, people behaving often in inconsistent and contradictory ways because they have split intentions and internal conflicts. And that's a lot of what the chart symbolizes, and you're trying to help the client understand so they can better resolve those conflicts and begin to express themselves in ways that are more integrated and ultimately functional and healthy. So if you go back to the basic needs, Aries would simply be the need for survival, the need for being, the need for autonomy, the need for freedom. It's the most primary, sort of prime directive of the human condition, to survive, to be free. Taurus, the need for security, safety, stability, attachment, having a stable attachment to an other, the need to possess and to own and to be comfortable, to have things. That's all related to Taurus. Gemini is simply the need for learning, the need for language, the need for communication, to be able to classify and label and define and communicate. Cancer, the need for emotional connection, the need for unconditional love and belonging. Leo, the need for creative self-expression. We all have a need to express ourselves and elicit approval and gain validation and build self-esteem, to develop a sense of identity that's differentiated from our families and from our peer group. You can go right on through the zodiac, and it can sort of crystallize out of the behavior of each sign the fundamental organizing motivational principle
that's all in here,
implicit in that sign.
That's all in here.
That's all in there, yeah.
Okay. Question number 6. The houses as the places for the manifestation of the planetary processes.
Yeah, the way I think about houses, and it's a common metaphor, it doesn't originate with me, is that they're like settings, in the same way that when the curtain opens and you're looking at a play, you're looking at a setting. You can only see one setting at a time unless you have a split stage. But generally, there's an environment there. It's a location, it's a place within which the action of the characters unfolds. So the planetary actors, we might say, come out onto that stage and perform their roles, modified, qualified by the nature of the sign the planets occupy. But those planets in their signs are performing actions in particular ways within an environmental context, which we call the house. So it's a set of circumstances. It's a slice of life, in a way, a department of life that certain kinds of events and certain kinds of characters also are encountered. So if you have a planet in a house, like you've got Saturn, let's say in the third house, and third house is sources of information, educators, people from whom we learn, then those third house figures are going to have a Saturnian cast. In other words, they're going to be perceived and experienced through a Saturnian lens, so that they literally embody Saturnian third house figures. At the same time, our Saturn is operating and performing its role in that third house context and approaching the requirements of that house in a Saturnian way. So, understanding how planets in houses are both prospects, that is, actions and approaches to the circumstances of that house, while also symbolizing content, that is, the actual outcome, the circumstances, and people that we encounter in that house, makes for interesting interpretive material, where the same planet has both an inner psychological meaning as well as an environmental external meaning.
Question number 7. The manifestation of the core beliefs of the individual in the chart.
Are you asking me like
Yes.
how are core beliefs symbolized in the chart?
Well, it's from your book, the manifestation of the core beliefs of the individual in his chart. So the core beliefs are manifest it's themselves in the chart. How do you approach that topic?
Well, I wouldn't put it that way. So I don't know exactly what you're reading, but I'm sure it's part of a larger.
On the back of your back of your book.
Oh, okay, yeah. Where is my book here? Because I'd love to see exactly what you're reading, but I don't have my book in front of me. But what I'm really saying, you with me, Volker?
Yes, I'm with you.
Is that beliefs are what we might call in systems theory emergent properties. They emerge out of the component parts that comprise them. And the components of a belief being a more complex entity in a sense, are the signs and the planets and the houses that comprise that belief. In other words, if you look at a planetary configuration, like I was just saying, Moon Pisces in the 3rd house, opposition Pluto Virgo in the 9th house. That's a 7 variable configuration involving 2 signs, 2 planets, 2 houses, and an aspect, an angle. See, so you take those 7 variables and you weave them together, and you have a story of sorts. It's like a subplot within the larger story that the chart as a whole signifies. See? And when the client comes in and, in this case, she's 52 years old, and she starts telling me about an experience that she's having where she's an office manager and she's responsible for organizing information. She's in the 3rd house. She's sort of like the mommy figure in this dental office. And these people are coming in and they're suffering, Moon in Pisces, and she has to respond to the suffering and make sure they get their appointment and everything's organized properly. And they're in kind of plutonic trauma. And she's in relationship, she's in partnership with a dentist. And so the dentist is also going to be that Pluto, Moon, Pisces, 3rd house figure that is operating in that context, has to properly diagnose and make a recommendation for treatment. And so the client tells me a story how she's in a power struggle with her boss, the dentist, who behaves very much like her mother did, who was overwhelmed and distraught and largely dysfunctional and incompetent in her performance of her duties as a mother when my client was 7 years old. So the underlying belief that we might infer from this story that the client is telling me is that she anticipates that people with whom she's in relationship with that are maternal figures for her, are going to disappoint her. They're going to be distraught, overwhelmed, chaotic, dysfunctional, incompetent, and also untrustworthy in the sense that her mother violated her trust. So she's also anticipating that this dentist that is her boss is also going to violate her trust, which frequently happens, and it stirs up all these feelings. See, she doesn't feel like she can depend on, that she's emotionally safe, that that the dental office in her relationship is a nurturing container. And so there's all these experiences that she has with her dentist that recapitulate that it's a kind of reenactment of an original traumatic scenario that goes back to when she was 7 years old. That is almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. She's got this internal story in her head that goes back to her experience with her mother, symbolized by that configuration. That's going to get repeated over time. In particular, at that age of 52 that corresponds to Pluto, that belief system really came up, in a sense, to be worked on, to be understood differently, so she could relate to her boss and say and do with her boss what she wasn't able to say and do as a child with her mother. See? In other words, to confront the boss and to work it out in a more healthy way so she can better get the needs of those respective planets, Moon and Pluto, met in current circumstances. Whereas when she was younger, that was the origin of the wound. So I hope that all hangs together, but that's a quick little case example to illustrate what
Yeah.
I mean by, core belief. If you gotta, really narrow it down, it would be like, I believe that I can't depend on others to fulfill my emotional needs, that they will in some way be wounded and will violate or betray me, and I will be injured, traumatized all over again in relation to sources of caring that I'm dependent on. That's a story, a prediction of sorts, that then gets reenacted in relation to current people that recapitulate what happened in the past.
Talking about stories in your book and in a webinar on your homepage, you were talking about life scripts. You were using Groundhog Day movie.
Groundhog Day, yes.
Groundhog Day. You use it in your book and in the webinar on your homepage. Life scripts. In your book, a very central chapter is the last one. Dispositors and significators, and the chains you can find in the charts.
Chains of dispositorship chains.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
the linkage of one planet to another.
What is this concept? First question, we have this concept in Germany. The dispositor chain is Gertrud Hamers, and the significant chain is Hermann Mayer and Michael Roscher, but you wouldn't know these people because they published only in German. Where did you get the idea of these chains for the life scripts?
Well, I think the rudimentary idea went back to Richard Eidemann. I remember when I was like in my mid-20s, and I was taking a class, and we were looking at the chart of Charles Darwin, and he said, take this chart home and trace out the chain of dispositors, by which I mean, just to make sure we're all on the same page here. A dispositor is a planet that rules the sign that another planet is in. So, for example, if I have Jupiter in Capricorn, Saturn would be the dispositor of my Jupiter. It's like a relay race where Jupiter hands the baton off to Saturn and, in a sense, tells Saturn, okay, you take it from here, help me fulfill my objectives. So Jupiter in Capricorn in the 10th house is going to have a goal that's consistent with what Jupiter is striving to do. But that goal is filtered through the sign of Capricorn that then, as a need, triggers the Saturn function. So Saturn gets activated, and like a relay race, it takes the information from Jupiter and it carries it forward. And Saturn's in Virgo, so it activates the ruler of Virgo, Mercury, and Mercury takes it from there. And you have this linkage, very much like the plot structure of a story. See? So if you're looking at a movie and you're looking at a scene, it's like you're looking at a planet. Maybe that planet is in relationship to other planets, but there's a primary actor in the scene. And as that scene unfolds, at some point, it comes to an end, but it activates the next scene, especially if the story is told coherently in an intelligible sequence. And so, there's a series of scenes that unfold. And if we look at an astrological chart, it's just breaking it up into component parts, not understanding the linkage between them, then we can't really see how the chart as a whole tells a story. It's more like we're looking at 10 different screens, in which scenes are all occurring simultaneously, but don't seem to have any discernible relationship to one another. They like having 10 television channels going on simultaneously on 10 different television screens, and you don't really know what the connection is. It seems like they're separate stories, but they're not. And the linkage, the dispositorship chain, as well as planets signifying the houses that begin with the sign that that planet rules, it shows how everything is wired up and connected to one another, see, and that there's a discernible plot structure, structure of action. that is leading toward sometimes a final dispositor, a planet that's in its own sign that ends the chain. It can be sometimes several chains. Sometimes a chain will loop back on itself so that there's no one final dispositor or ending to that sequence of action. But all of these chains, they mean something. You know, they tell, in effect, the nature of the story. And what I liked about the film Groundhog Day is that it's, in a way, it's a film that is itself a metaphor of the astrological chart, in the sense that the astrological chart, in comprising the story. I'm so sorry, Volker. I feel sorry
Well,
for you.
it's okay.
I wish you were feeling better. Yeah, it must be awful.
No, you are talking.
I'll talk, you sneeze.
Mm-hmm. So come back to Groundhog Day.
Yeah, so Groundhog Day tells a story, much like the astrological chart, tells a story that repeats. It's not like the story begins at birth and then it ends with the last planet or final dispositor, at death. It's a repeating story that's sort of like a spiral that starts off narrow and shallow at the bottom, and then as the story evolves and keeps cycling round and round the same territory, just like the sun goes around the chart once a year and it activates every single degree of every sign and triggers every aspect in the chart. So also our story, inherent in our chart, is repetitive. But within that framework of repetition, there's the possibility of a deepening and widening and integration of consciousness. See, and so that the potential of that story is actualized over time. That the astrological chart, unlike what traditional astrology presumed, isn't a map of a static character in a rigid, predetermined, fixed fate. The astrological chart, even though it looks fixed, is actually symbolic of a dynamic, evolving process. So that as that process evolves over time, the way the person expresses him or herself and experiences his fate evolves. It changes to reflect the learning and the integration and the development that particular dynamic process symbolized in the chart represents. That's what Groundhog Day is all about. It's a story, but in the metaphor is that there's a day that comprises the story that keeps repeating. And in the framework of that day, the main character, played by Bill Murray, keeps learning, and he experiments and he tries a whole variety of things. In the beginning, from a very narcissistic, egocentric kind of place, but eventually he evolves toward a more altruistic, enlightened, awakened state of consciousness. And in so doing, he begins to experience that day in a way that is maximally fulfilling. And so, as a film, as a story, Groundhog Day, I think, is a perfect metaphor of every human life and every astrological chart.
So basically you have two life scripts, the dispositor life script and the significator life script.
Well, I wouldn't really say they're different. They're overlapping, and they're really part of the same flow. You look at the chart, again, beginning with signs, they're planetary rulers, the signs that the planets occupy and houses they're tenant, and the aspects that they make to other planets. Is just like understanding a script. You've got characters. The characters have motivation. They have a backstory. The signs that the houses that they signify, and the planets they dispose. And they have relationships among themselves. Those relationships and the context in which those relations occur comprise the larger narrative, the plot structure. The structure, the sequence of action is indicated by the chain of dispositors and signification. And so when you start to look at it all as a whole, it's essentially a life script or personal narrative or personal mythology that gets played out over time at successively higher levels of awareness, ideally.
Okay. So in your practice, you not only analyze the chart, you do prognosis. What techniques do you use?
Well, prognosis is not really a technique. It's just a name for prognostication. That is being able to sort of infer or hypothesize where things are moving, where things are headed.
Yeah, but there are certain astrological techniques. You use the transits, I suppose. Do you use solar?
Well, depending on how you want to define prognosis, in medicine, prognosis is what is the course of the disease? Where is it heading? Is it a good prognosis? Is the person likely to heal? Or is it a bad prognosis? Is it terminable? Is it a terminal disease? And it's the same with the astrological chart and working with somebody in psychotherapy. They come in with a problem and you formulate some tentative diagnosis. They may have, in fact, something like a personality disorder, or more typically what we call a comorbid condition, where there's a variety of behaviors that are consistent with different personality disorders, psychopathology, and so forth. And you try to understand what is the nature of the disorder, the problem, the issue that the client is presenting, using the chart as a diagnostic aid. Now, once you locate the relevant factors in the chart that are symbolizing the nature of the problem the client presents, then you can use that same configuration as a prognostic device or tool, because the solution to the client's issue is in the same configuration that symbolizes the problem. And the reason for that is that the problem is going to be in a dysfunctional, unintegrated expression of the configuration that symbolizes the issue. Usually it's some kind of intrapsychic conflict, see, that is represented by stresses and tensions in the chart that correspond to some really difficult configuration, like, and going back to the example I've been using, Moon Pisces opposed Pluto from the 3rd to the 9th. See, that's like a psychological complex in Jungian terms. See, it's also an intrapsychic conflict with associated defenses. It gets projected. You track circumstances and people to you that represent the vehicle, the external manifestation of the intrapsychic problem. See? Now, if the client is working, see, and they're amenable to therapy, they're able to look at themselves and take responsibility for the difficulties that they're having, see, and they can utilize the interpretations that the counselor, astrologer, therapist provides, so that they progressively gain insight. They begin to change their thinking and resolve the underlying wound that was the origin of the problem, that might have gone back to some early traumatic experience. See, then the prognosis of Moon Pisces opposed Pluto Virgo is positive. You can say, well, in time, that Moon Pluto, to the extent it becomes integrated and a functional expression of that part of the chart, is going to be expressed and manifested differently, both behaviorally and in terms of experience. How they think, how they feel, how they relate, how they express that part of their chart is going to be more consistent with what we might hypothesize is the integrated functional version of that same configuration that symbolized the original problem. And vice versa, the event world, the nature of their circumstances and relationships, likewise will change to reflect the integration and the growth and the healing that has occurred on an internal level, vis-a-vis that same configuration.
In your practice, is the number of clients with psychotherapy who come for psychotherapy where astrology is added, is that the most part of your clients, or do you have more astrological clients?
No, I'd say that, in a given week, I might have 2 or 3 astrological consultations, and maybe 7 or 8 regular clients.
Oh, okay. So
And
looking
that's sort of my optimal balance, really, because
looking at those 2 to 3 astrological clients, what sort of future-orientated methods do you use? Do you use transits? I suppose you do. You use a sun return? I suppose you do.
What was that last one?
Sun return, a solar chart.
Yeah, I don't do a whole lot of that.
How about progressions and
progressions? Yeah, I use transits and progressions.
transits?
I
And
don't really, I'm not big on predictive astrology, so I'm not particularly interested in spending a lot of time with a whole, wide range of predictive techniques to try to anticipate what's going to be happening in the future. My predictive philosophy is, if you want to know what's going to happen in the future, pay attention when you get there.
Oh, okay. When in 1997 there was this large conference in San Francisco, Return the Soul to Cosmos. You were a lecturer there, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Cosmos and Psyche.
Return the Soul.
No, that was Tarnis's book, but there was a conference that had a similar name.
Yes, I think that the name of the conference was Return the Soul to Cosmos.
Okay, yeah.
And it were 1,000 people attending. You did a lecture there. I think there's no book about this conference. Do you know why not?
Is that 1992?
1997.
Oh, 97. Yeah, that was probably in San Francisco.
Yes.
Yeah.
But there's no book about this conference.
Not that I'm aware of.
Oh, okay. Because you would know, because you gave a lecture, you would know that.
Yeah. There was Barbara Morgan and put that conference on, and there was a lot of really interesting people there that were, both in the field of psychology, talking about synchronicity and Jungian psychology, and also, of course, more psychologically oriented, for the most part, astrologers. And
let me come to a conference in England, 2005, Robert Hand lecturing about postmodern astrology. Did you know his approach?
Yes. I mean, do I know, in a lot of detail to the point that I practice medieval astrology? I would say no, but I know what he said.
The approach of Robert Hand, as far as I understand him, is, okay, we had the history of astrology, we had the dark age of astrology in the 18th century, and so on and so forth. We have a revival of older techniques, let's put it this way.
Mm-hmm.
We have a very, very important development of astrology in the 20th century, and the postmodern astrology is sort of a new paradigm, combining everything available and doing something new with it. How far away are you from that approach?
Very far and not very far simultaneously. And let me explain what I mean by that. I think that, his overall analysis of the evolution of astrology, and he was really saying that there was a lot of information, techniques, astrological literature that had been, for the most part, lost, going back to, early Hellenistic days of the origins of natal astrology. And there were people that were working at that time in the field, for the most part, in traditional astrology. Robert Zoller, who was a medievalist, along with Robert Hand, and they could, translate old Latin texts into English. And I think it was Robert Schmidt that was an expert in interpreting Greek, in translating it into English. So there was a lot of recovery going on, and Hand was part of that movement. And he was very excited about it, understandably. There was all this rich new material that was being, for the first time, brought back in to astrology. And I think from the perspective of the traditionalists, there was this sense that for the first time, we can now have a more full, complete astrology by having access to these ancient techniques that had sort of fallen by the wayside, almost like, the expression in biology where you have a vestigial organ that sort of falls away, like the tail falls off, and they're sort of going back and, restoring to the body of astrology these vestigial organs that had been sloughed off over the course of time, not seeing the loss of those organs as necessary in a sense for the evolution of astrology, but in fact as real losses that need to be restored for the body of astrology to be made complete. Now, his postmodern astrology would be much more heavily accenting the utilization of those traditional techniques with the more contemporary psychological ideas that came out of humanistic astrology, which is essentially that the birth chart represents a developmental process and the actualization of human potential and growth. Those ideas of growth and change and healing and development were never part of traditional astrology. So Hand was thinking we can make a marriage between contemporary psychological astrology and all these old techniques who were much more wedded to a more deterministic, fatalistic model that astrology was operating from. So in that sense, I would disagree with him. See, I think astrology does evolve, and it's important to understand the history, but I don't think a lot of those techniques and the way that they were utilized in traditional astrology are compatible. See, it's almost like we've made a discontinuous jump or leap, a quantum leap away from traditional astrology into a whole new kind of astrology. And I don't think the old techniques and the new understanding psychologically are compatible. Signs, the meanings of signs, the meanings of planets, the meanings of houses, aspects, dispositorships, and things like that. The basic fundamental parts of astrology, yes, that can make the trip, that can make the jump. But when you start to utilize all those variables in a rigid, deterministic, fatalistic framework, those methods and techniques that are at the heart of traditional astrology are simply not compatible with a psychologically oriented astrology. So that's where I think he and I differ in terms of what will comprise of a true postmodern, or, I'm going to like the word because postmodern has certain connotations that I don't think are quite appropriate. But, let's say a later, more sophisticated, more evolved understanding of what astrology can be, I don't think is going to be, at least the way that I think about it. This is just my point of view. Lots of people in traditional astrology that are not going to agree with me, Robert Hand probably among them. But I don't think a lot of the traditional techniques are compatible with the psychological approach to working with people. So I think they were left behind for good reason.
Okay. You had quite a special experience when you were talking in India. Do you want to talk about it today?
Yeah, I can. I'll just kind of touch on the basics, but
okay, do that.
Yeah,
quite interesting story for our viewers.
Yeah, well, they probably anybody who's watching this video probably has some awareness of what happened anyway.
I can tell the viewers we have a playlist, Professor Dr. Glenn Perry, on this channel, and you will find the episode in India on the playlist.
Oh, you mean the actual lecture?
Yes.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, I was invited to give a lecture in India that was going to be, there was going to be a lot of Western astrologers there, as well as a lot of Indian astrologers. So there was excitement because this was a particular conference that was unique in the sense that it was in India. And, there had been 2 or 3 before that, I think, and there will be more after. But it was a Western astrology and Vedic astrology coming together to see if they can build bridges and find some commonality. And I regard Vedic astrology as part of traditional astrology. It's really kind of Hellenistic astrology that had migrated over to India in the 1st century BC, and then it took on a sort of, trappings of that culture, and it has sort of evolved, but really didn't really change appreciably from the roots that were in that early Hellenistic conception of what astrology was. So it's very traditional, but it also utilizes the sidereal zodiac, and that's the main difference between Vedic astrology and other forms of traditional astrology, whether Hellenistic or whether medieval. and of course, contemporary Western psychological tropically based astrology. So have always been really, really interested in that tension between the two zodiacs and how it came to be, and you know, why is there two different zodiacs, and which zodiac came first, and if there was a bifurcation and a splitting apart of an original zodiac, where and how exactly did that occur? And there's been different books and authors that have investigated this before me, but I sort of went back, did my own research, and there's a lot more information available now than there used to be. So I told the organizers of the conference that I was going to do a talk on the tropical and the sidereal zodiac, and we had to write an article as well that would be published in the conference proceedings. And so I wrote the article and I sent it off, and it was, they had it at least a month or so before the conference. And then I gave my talk, and I basically argued that here's the history of the zodiac. This is how it evolved. And this is where it split apart, around the 1st century BC with the discovery of precession. And then, I always want to say Herodotus, but it wasn't. It was Hipparchus. Hipparchus that discovered, he was a Greek astronomer, and he discovered the precession of the equinoxes. Although he didn't really understand, what the astronomy was, he just knew that the vernal point was precessing backwards against the backdrop of the fixed stars, and that the constellations were no longer reliable indicators of the seasons. And so the original reason that the zodiac came into being, which was as a way of determining when the seasons were going to start, because the seasons in agriculture were so central to organization of tribal life. It was their calendar in the sky, in effect, their clock. And so the meanings of the constellations and the whole purpose of the zodiac was really as a predictive tool for discerning exactly when the seasons were going to change and what to do when, at what time of year, so that the community was on track with what nature required of it to survive and prosper. So when Hipparchus discovered that the constellations were not reliable markers of the seasons, as had always been supposed up until that point, it represented a fundamental shift in our thinking in astrology. And it was, in effect, it was the beginning of the divorce of the zodiac from the constellations, so that it became a strictly tropical-based, seasonally based zodiac. And again, to keep the zodiac in accord with the seasons of which it was always designed to be. Somehow, India, and during that period of time where there was this transition from the tropical sidereal hybrid is really what it was up until the time of Hipparchus. Then there was the split. It's like the migration of Hellenistic astrology to India carried with it, this understanding of the original tropical sidereal hybrid. And so they continue to use the constellations as markers of the signs, where they began, where they ended, and so forth. And what I would argue was a mistake. It was just a historical error. And you can make a really good argument for that. Whereas I don't think there's any really sound or intelligible arguments for how the sidereal zodiac could have originated independent of the seasons. Just no way to make sense out of that. So I gave this lecture, and it was in India. A lot of my Western counterparts felt that it was offensive to my guests, because I was basically in India saying that I think that the sidereal zodiac is a historical error, and here's my argument why. Now, I felt like I was just giving an academic paper, however controversial my conclusions might be. But in astrology, we this kind of gets into a lot of other areas, but I think we have a kind of circle the wagon, slightly paranoid, ingrown mentality in which criticism of one another is not really encouraged or even allowed. There's a sort of underlying hidden unspoken rule that we don't challenge one another because we're so ridiculed and constantly criticized and rejected and um, um, by people on the outside, scientific, academic, even the religious community, that astrologers are sort of ingrown and, defensive. And so the last thing anybody wants inside that circle is to be criticized, to say, well, I think this is wrong. And even though every other field has to critique itself and has to utilize critical thinking and research and present arguments and embrace those inevitable controversies and disagreements that occur in every field, I think it's been hard historically, right up to the present, for astrologers to do that. So when I did it, and in other ways that I've done it in the past, it often is reacted to with tremendous hostility and anger. And so that's what happened. Different Western astrologers petitioned to have me removed as chair of the ethics committee. And I was also chair of research in the ESAR is an international organization. And so they were under such pressure from really 5 or 6 outspoken people that were there at the conference where I gave the talk that I was putting ESAR in a bad position. So I resigned my board position and my chairmanship of the ethics and my position as chair of research.
So how is your situation in 2019? Are you out of all the organizations, so you're doing your academy?
No, I'm still a member of NCGR and ESAR and AFAN.
But not in a function, you're just a member.
Yeah, I'm just a member, and I think that's probably how I want to keep it. I think that what I do and the fact that I can be somewhat unspoken, a little bit of a loose cannon, I suppose, at least from their point of view, and that I kind of feel like, we need to be able to critique one another and engage in reasoned debate and allow for disagreements, and think critically, and so forth in the field. It naturally creates controversies within a field that is not particularly amenable, receptive to that approach to astrology. So it's better that I think I do that, on my own, rather than as a representative of an organization, because it puts the organization in a tight spot.
Basically, I would evaluate the story because I've watched the lecture and the reaction to the lecture. There is a lot of reaction in the internet. If I had to put a verdict on the whole thing, I would say this is evidence, factual evidence, that the astrological scene is incapable of academic discourse. Would you disagree or agree?
Well, I might not put it that strongly, but I get what you mean.
Well, I feel that way. I think I'm a lawyer by profession.
Ah, so
There's evidence, factual evidence, and you can draw conclusions of the evidence. You can watch the videos in the internet. You can read the texts on the internet about the event and about what happened to you afterwards. And I personally come to the strong conclusion. This is one of the reasons why this field of astrology has a real problem.
Thank you. That's one person in my camp.
No, you're wrong. In Germany, there are more. People thinking like me, I would count 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 at least. And your problem is you don't know them because they speak German. Okay, let's come back to a last question. I have a hypothesis to offer. In case you know the Red Book of Professor Jung. Are you familiar with the Red Book of Professor Jung?
I'm familiar with its existence. I haven't purchased it or bought it.
Do you know the story? Do you know the story about when the Red Book was created? Sort of.
Yes. Yeah, I do.
I have a hypothesis for the final of this episode, of the second episode with Glenn Perry. What Jung did from 1913 up till 1932 in writing that Red Book is he wrote down what he experienced.
Yes.
And if you look at the pictures, at the mandalas, and if you read the texts, I proposed the theory he was in direct communication with archetypes. What do you think about that?
I think there's probably real truth to that because, he has this exact square between his sun and Neptune. And he talked about it, although he didn't realize what he was talking about astrologically, between the, self with a small s and the self with a capital S. The larger self, which he would call the totality of the psyche, fully individuated whole being in which all the divisions and conflicts are reconciled into a harmonious functional unity. And the small self, which is ego self, the portion of self in the larger sense that's accessible to conscious awareness. And the sun is, in a lot of ways, it's our sense of identity. It's our ego self, the small self. And when it's in contact with Neptune, which symbolizes, one astrologer I don't know who it was, said that Neptune is like our umbilical cord to the divine, because it's the planet that is connected to Pisces, the last sign of the zodiac, thus the totality, the unit of consciousness, source consciousness, however you want to call that, Brahman, Tao, God, the absolute, the divine ground, these different linguistic terms we can use to describe that ultimate, final, irreducible consciousness that is our source. But that's in a sense, the source of archetypes, which we can say are like energetic patterns, almost like ideas in a Platonic sense, in the mind of some superordinate divine being, which is the whole. Okay? So these archetypes are like, they're the gods and goddesses that in themselves exist within this larger being. They're not separate from that being. Okay? And so what he came to call the archetypes, are these component energetic patterns within the larger whole that can be differentiated from one another. Okay? And the fact that he had that Sun square Neptune meant that his conscious awareness was open, radically permeable, transparently and open to that Neptunian realm, which is why he was vulnerable to ego diffusion or psychosis. And had various psychotic.
It was risky. It was rather risky what he was doing.
But he had such a, it is the kind of the paradox. Here he has Sun in Leo, which is, the strongest position for the Sun to be in. It's in its own sign. And it's really about creatively expressing and bringing out what's inside. And at the same time, he's radically open to the divine realm, and which is populated by these archetypal components or energetic ideas, forms. And so he's channeling them. He's literally accessing them directly and experiencing them in terms of images and feelings and ultimately meanings that can be expressed in a way that's intelligible. So he's giving form, creative form, through symbolism and through an articulation of the meaning of the symbols, these energetic archetypal patterns that exist in the collective. And it's right there in his chart, Sun square Neptune exact.
So is that the future of humanity? Is Jung the pioneer? And in 100 or 200 or 300 years from now, everybody is able to communicate with his or the archetypes?
It's an interesting question. I would imagine that we will become increasingly conscious over time. I mean, it's a long evolutionary process, but I think, astrology is really, really important, again, because it provides a language of consciousness, and it allows us to articulate and differentiate these different component parts, which we call astrological archetypes, and understand their essence, their feel, how they manifest symbolically in events, images mean, every event in the outside world is very much, in my mind, like a dream image. It has the same import. You can interpret it the same way that you interpret symbols in dreams. Okay? And so the more we're able to have access to those images in those processes that the archetypes represent, understand them on their own terms, see, and embody them, work with them, integrate them, then I think that, like Jung, we become sort of conscious participants, consciously evolving along that path of individuation to become the indivisible whole that Jung's process of individuation tried to articulate, and that he himself, I think, is the best example of.
So finally, what's your future? What do you wish for your personal future? You have quite a journey. We had this first episode with you about your biographical facts and your experiences in San Francisco and in Seattle and Kepler College. Then you moved back to Connecticut and you have your academy, rather nice thing to do without any overseers and any bureaucrats. So you are settled sort of in your academy. You have your students. You have even students in China. We won't talk about China as a topic. What's your wish for the future? Just to continue the academy, or is there something new on the horizon? Or do you start trying to contact your archetypes?
Well, I probably always will be doing that. They're certainly contacting me. Whether I'm contacting them or not, I'm not sure sometimes, but you don't have much choice in that. But I think I just want to keep doing what I'm doing, and do it as best I can, keep growing. I've got 9 books now, only 3 of which are on Amazon, and I want to get the other books in a form where I will publish them on Amazon, and
you should do
also
that.
revise.
You shouldn't use Amazon. That's a big company. Use BOD Norderstedt, and it's easier.
Well,
It's
we'll talk about that. Maybe
worldwide available. So
exclusive.
I hope your books are available soon, not in the long future. And as I told you, for each book is one project. Takes you only 1 hour if the Word document.
Okay, we'll talk about that separate. Yeah.
Okay.
So I want to write the books. And here's the thing, just to answer your question as simply as I can. I love teaching. I want to continue to have the school grow. I want to get my books published. I want to continue to work with clients because that really is the source material, I think, of my case histories and, continually deepening and refining my understanding of how astrology works. I just think it's really, really hard to really get good at astrology if you don't work with people in an ongoing way. Not that you can't, but I think that's the richest, most useful source material for really understanding how astrology works and developing a really grounded theory. So it's not just, a lot of, rarefied, highly refined theoretical ideas that are then wedded to astrology, but don't have much practical application in actually working with clients. But I also want to make videos. That's kind of what I think would be most fun and creative. And for my life, I think in a way come full circle, because I always felt like that little 3-year stint I did in Hollywood where I wanted to be a screenwriter is sort of like unfinished business. And to be able to, create some kind of video, that has a beginning and a middle and an end, just like a story, and use YouTube for presenting little mini films on astrology. Maybe it'll just begin like what we're doing with just talking about different ideas. But I'd love to utilize imagery and clips maybe of people in the news or people in different scenes in films, and start to weave that together with astrological charts that all can be part of a presentation on YouTube to illustrate some astrological concept or teaching that I'm trying to present. So that's what I think in the future for me. I'd like to move in that direction as best I can.
So the playlist on our channel of Glenn Perry might grow.
Maybe.
Okay, I forgot to greet our viewers. I'm sorry and I apologize, but for the end, I thank you for watching the second episode with Glenn Perry in our series Archetypal Cosmology. Thank you very much, and till soon.
Thank you, Volker. Appreciate it. So